Dr. Anthony N. Sabga, Chairman Emeritus of the ANSCAFE Group and patron of these awards, executives of the ANSCAFE Group, members of the ANSCAFE Foundation Board, and members of the Caribbean Awards for Excellence Committees. Welcome to our 4th annual lecture featuring Professor Leonard Ogaro, a geneticist and plant pathologist from St. Vincent, who was our Science and Technology Laureate last year. I now invite Professor Ogaro to deliver his lecture, Vanishing Food Production in the Caribbean and How to Reverse It. Professor?
Pleasant good evening to everybody. I'd like to first express my gratitude to the ANSCAFE Caribbean Awards for Excellence Foundation for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. My intention here tonight is to talk about agriculture at the level of food crop production and how to lift it to exploit its full potential for sustaining economic growth and livelihoods. In this regard, I will offer new perspectives for consideration to improve the food security situation in the Caribbean. As you know, I'm a scientist by profession, and my foremost interest is in research and development, particularly in the areas of pathogen and plant genetics and modern biotechnology. This generally means that I come up with research ideas and concepts in my areas of expertise and take them through a process to arrive at a stage where they can be of benefit to people, often in a material way. My plan in this lecture is to start a similar process with a set of ideas to help with the transformation of crop agriculture to a more valuable and productive enterprise, and by extension, the improvement of the food security situation and the livelihood of farmers and the ordinary Caribbean citizens who are directly dependent on it. I will approach this lecture by assessing the importance of crop agriculture. For this assessment, I have generally chosen time periods that are long enough to reveal trends of performance for the purpose of highlighting concerns in the pattern impacting food security. The performance assessment of crop production, as mentioned before, will be done by answering the following questions. Slide, please. First, is the arable land as a productive asset for agriculture utilized optimally? Secondly, is agriculture functioning as a primary engine of economic growth? 3, is there adequate investment in agriculture to match the crop production expectations? 4, is crop production based on the utilization of the most effective and appropriate and available emerging modern science and technology? And finally, is agriculture functioning in a programmatic way to promote protection and conservation of the environment and sustainable use of the natural resource base? In this presentation, the responses to these questions are first introduced through an analysis of the situation for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Following this, the responses are further elaborated upon by presenting relevant information from selected CARICOM island countries. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which is first and foremost an agricultural country, is an excellent case around which the presentation can be framed for these island countries. The CARICOM countries of Belize, Suriname, and Guyana are characterized by more promising agricultural prospects and are not affected by many of the crop production challenges impacting the island states. For this reason, the agricultural situations are not discussed here. Similarly, the crop production situation in Haiti is not discussed. This has to do with difficulty in assessing primary official data for analysis. As mentioned before, the focus of this talk is on crop production. This is because agriculture in the Caribbean is overwhelmingly concerned about the cultivation of crops. Crop production is therefore an excellent medium for tracking the performance of agriculture in the Caribbean. The objective of the assessment, based on the approach described, is to highlight trends of concern with respect to the performance of the crop agriculture, with specific reference to food security, and to offer solutions for addressing them. New perspectives on the way forward for improving this performance in the response to the concerns identified are presented in the context of a model catering to crop production and food security by extension. Next slide, please. So the first question, therefore, is the arable land as a productive asset for agriculture used optimally? First, I will present an overview of the agricultural land settlement or land reform program in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to examine the first criterion for assessing the performance of agriculture. The land reform program is one of the most far-reaching aspects of social engineering devised to set up agriculture as we know it today. This program has put large numbers of ordinary citizens in private ownership of arable land, mostly relatively small holdings. For the foreseeable future, this land tenure situation is here to stay, and because of its pivotal importance, there is need to examine how well it is working and if it can work better. In the colonial era, commercial agriculture was initially confined to plantations or estates owned and monopolized by the British planter class. These plantations cornered the arable land and utilized slave labor to produce sugar, cotton, arrowroot, and cocoa, primarily for export. In this plantation-style agricultural system, root crops were also grown, but at subsistence levels by slaves for their personal upkeeps on small plots. The earliest scheme instituting land tenure or land reform or land distribution away from the planter class-dominated system in St. Vincent and the Grenadines began in 1899 and lasted until 1922. During this time, the colonial government granted lands to shopkeepers and craftsmen. Later on, other reforms introducing credit and tenure of rent came about during 1938 to 1939 and 1946 to 1961. Land reform or land distribution schemes were continued by subsequent governments up to recent times. For example, during the period 1974 to 1990, 12 estates amounting to just over 2,336 hectares in size were subdivided to make land available to farmers. Notwithstanding the land reform program from 1974 onwards, it is estimated that 12% of farmers are currently landless. Farm sizes are generally less than 2 acres, and they account for 67% of all agricultural holdings. It is also estimated that about 5% of the parcels of agricultural land are occupied by squatters, and 6.7% of them are rented. The remaining 73% of the parcels in private ownership are characterized as owner/owner-like, with reference to persons occupying them, meaning that ownership in some cases must be ascertained or resolved by proper documentation. Within this category, a common occurrence is for persons to occupy family lands. The pattern of land distribution and ownership is generally applicable to the CARICOM island states. For example, the landless category of farmers is a common occurrence. A case in point is Jamaica, where out of a total of 187,791 recorded farmers in 1979, 14,990 were landless. In 2007, the number of landless farmers was 28,000, 270 out of a total of just about 228,500 farmers. It was intended by all successive governments that the land reform program from inception would lead to increasing utilization of arable land to fuel economic development, increasing employment, and improving income levels of rural communities. Through them, agriculture advanced from the primacy of the plantation or estate system to include subsistence farming and then smallholder production of cash crops such as bananas and a very limited number of medium-sized commercial farms. Next slide, please. The table that you're looking at shows for St. Vincent and the Grenadines the total number of agricultural holdings and the sum of their corresponding acreage over 28 years, inclusive of the most active period of land subdivision and land distribution, namely from 1974 to 1990. In 1972, the number of agricultural land holdings was estimated at 7,974, corresponding to 34,355 acres. By 1985, there were 8,600 holdings altogether, measuring 29,695 acres. However, by 2000, the number of holdings was similar to the amount for 1972, but with an almost 50% decline in acreage. The loss of farmland in significant amounts is a common trend, and I will now illustrate with these examples. Slide, please. For example, during the period 1961 to 2007, about 2/3 of the agricultural land was lost. There's also significant fragmentation of the land. In Dominica, next one, please. In Dominica, farmland has also been lost in amounts of 23,884 acres out of 73,000 cases during the period 1958 to 2001. There is also fragmentation of the farms. In Trinidad and Tobago, there has been a dramatic change in the number of agricultural holdings, and this was not associated with the consolidation of holdings into larger units. For example, in 2004, the recorded number of agricultural land holdings was 19,143 in 2004, compared to 30,566 in 1982. This change in amount represents a decline of 37%. Let me return to the reference situation of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The extent and pattern of utilization of the arable land for farming in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is shown in the slide. This illustration shows that the total arable land area planted with crops. The total amount of land cultivated generally varies on an annual basis, as indicated for the period 2003 to 2008. During this period, the acreage planted per year ranged from 12,083 to 9,464, but substantial amounts are cultivated on a temporary basis. As mentioned before, it is noteworthy that between 1972 and 2001, the area under agriculture declined by 50%. This pattern of agricultural land use is similar across all of the CARICOM island countries. For example, the amount of land available for cultivating field crops, excluding land for pastures, for natural and cultivated pastures, land with abandoned and semi-abandoned crops and pastures and forests. This was estimated at 47,460 hectares in Trinidad and Tobago. Next slide, please. Of this base amount, the area under traditional agriculture ranged from 5,350 to 9,766 hectares. In St. Lucia, the extent of cultivation of farmland declined from 42,872 acres in 1996 to 24,530 acres. Next one, please. So you can see, certainly for St. Lucia, the loss of farmland continues. And in Jamaica, next slide, there has also been a steady decline in the acreage of farmland cultivated, and this was accompanied by a dramatic increase in the fragmentation into smaller plots. The overall picture from all of the information presented here is one of increasing loss and underutilization of land for agriculture. The reasons for these are that some farmers have left agriculture because it became unprofitable for them, and significant amounts of agricultural land have been converted to residential and commercial developments. Agriculture continues to face increasing competition for land for residential and commercial developments, both of which are more profitable than planting crops at the moment. Notwithstanding, agriculture is still regarded as an important productive economic sector in the CARICOM island states, and it is vital to the livelihood and the very existence of rural communities. Government's policies governing it invariably seek to increase efficiency and competitiveness and expand crop production for local consumption and export, while at the same time conserving natural resources. I will now move on to give a response to the second question: is agriculture functioning as a primary engine of economic growth? I will now talk about crop production again, with reference introducing it through the St. Vincent the Grenadines situation. The recorded yield of crops for St. Vincent the Grenadines during their post-independence period is shown in the next slide. Generally, the yield for each crop declined drastically or remained relatively small, with little or mostly no growth. Declining yields for banana and arrowroot, the two foremost crops targeted for export on relatively large scales, are most prominent. The impact of these declines have been a serious setback for the development of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The general lack of growth in the amounts of produce for the other crops adds to this setback. The crop production pattern characterized here by declining relatively little or no growth is repeated for the remaining Caribbean island states. Next slide. For example, in Dominica, where the contribution of agriculture to gross domestic product is still a primary driver of economic activity, the trend is illustrated there. So in other words, for all of the crop sectors, there's very little or declining growth over very long periods. I now wish to return to the St. Vincent the Grenadines situation and look at the performance of the plant crop sector and to highlight its decline between the period 1979 to 2010. And this decline has contributed significantly to a decline in the gross domestic product of St. Vincent the Grenadines. Next slide. This contribution, as you can see, fell from 12.74% in 1970 to 1983, and then to 4.63% by year 2010. The relative decline in the contribution of agriculture to St. Lucia economy was also recorded, as evidenced by the percent GDP values ranging from 2.84 to 4.37 during the period 2008 to 2012. Next slide. In St. Kitts and Nevis, next slide, agriculture has now become a relatively small economic sector. In Trinidad and Tobago, as you know, primary agriculture is also a relatively small economic sector, as evidenced by its contribution of less than 1% to GDP per year. Next slide. In Jamaica, there has been a progressive decline in the contribution of agriculture to GDP relative to other domestic sectors of the economy. Next slide. Now, in contrast to the extent of contributions of agriculture to the economies of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica, agriculture is a more important contributor to Dominica's economy. Next slide. I will now present information on the crops featured earlier in the slide in greater detail to illustrate the setback further and to mention a few specific examples of its ramifications. The figure I mentioned earlier was about the crop production situation for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Next slide. Next one. For this presentation, the crops featured are conveniently grouped in two categories. One group comprises banana and arrowroot. The other crops targeted primarily for export. The remaining ones are bundled together as the food crops, which make up the other group. The fruit crops have a lower export profile than banana and arrowroot and are the backbone of agriculture for local consumption. I will talk about the fruit crop sector first. Now, the progressive decline and/or stagnation in production of food crops have contributed to St. Vincent and the Grenadines becoming a net food importing country. Next slide. So actually, this happened in 1997, as highlighted there. For example, for the period 2005 to 2008, the value of imported foods ranged from 110 to 186% of the value of exports. Amongst the imports of vegetables included cabbage, sweet pepper, carrots, tomato, lettuce, and cucumber, all of which have been previously grown traditionally to self-sufficiency levels in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It is evident that food production targets to prevent St. Vincent and the Grenadines from becoming a net food importing country have been unmet. All CARICOM states are currently net food importers to varying extents. For example, in St. Lucia, food imports annually were 4 to 15 times more than food exports during the period 2007 to 2012. Next one, please. St. Kitts and Nevis is even more dependent on food imports, which exceeded food exports by 48 to 130 times during the period 2005 to 2011. Next slide. Notwithstanding the earlier observation of increasing agricultural GDP for Dominica, food production there also has not been at levels to prevent Dominica from becoming a net food importing country. Dominica imported 2 to 2.7 times more food by monetary value than it exported during the years 2010 to 2012. In Jamaica, next slide, please. In Jamaica, food security is a major concern, as evidenced by the increasing large proportion of total imports associated with food consumption, and spectacularly there in the period 1997 to 2001, just under 40% of total imports for Jamaica was associated with the importation of food. In Trinidad and Tobago, food security concerns pertaining to food staples in particular have been identified. The following example illustrates these concerns. During the period 2005 to 2009, imports of food staples averaged 236,700 tons at a value of 694 million Trinidad dollars. These amounts represent 29% by weight and 20% by monetary value, both of all food imports into Trinidad and Tobago. The current production and consumption levels of important selected food crops of Trinidad and Tobago are shown here. Next slide. Now, bridging the gap between domestic food production and consumption levels for these crops illustrated will require significant additional investments to improve crop productivity. I can assure you certainly that the additional farmland required is available because, as I indicated earlier, it is underutilized. Now, I will now return to the situation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to highlight the additional ramifications arising from the decline of the crop production sector. Next slide. In this regard, the focus is on banana and arrowroot. Now, banana production dominated agriculture in St. Vincent and the Grenadines during the post-independence period and peaked during 1988 to 1993, when the amount of fruit exported ranged from 61,836 tons to 58,371 tons annually. During the period of peak production, banana occupied 1,042 hectares of arable land. Significant and steady decline in the amount of banana exported began in 1998, when 38,947 tons valued at $20.4 million were exported. By 2007, the amount exported was down to 18,393 tons for a value of $8.2 million. The decline in banana production and export around this time were due to changes in the rules of banana entering the European Union market, resulting in increased price competition from bananas coming from countries outside of the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific region. Around this time, 87.5% of banana farmers were forced out of the business, and the remaining ones have adjusted by reducing acreage, increasing sale under the Fair Trade brand, and increasing exports to a few regional countries. The main effect of the decline of banana production was therefore the underutilization of arable land, loss of vital foreign exchange, and plumbing livelihoods of rural communities. St. Lucia, which is the banana powerhouse of the Windward Islands, was more severely affected than St. Vincent and the Grenadines by the decline in banana production and exports. With respect to arrowroot, in addition to contracting yield, the area under cultivation is also declining. For example, regarding yield, this plummeted from 1,697,000 pounds in 2004 to 79,400 pounds in 2007. During the peak years of the mid-1970s and 1980s, the arrowroot industry employed over 68% of the rural population. At that time, the arrowroot starch was in great demand in North America and Europe. Currently, the industry is set back by numerous problems, including shortage of labor, particularly for harvesting, low yield, high cost of production, and low returns on investment to farmers. The primary effects of these setbacks for the arrowroot industry are the same ones mentioned for the banana industry. An important observation on the governance of the banana industries in St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and St. Lucia, and the arrowroot industry in St. Vincent, the Grenadines, is that these industries can be mistaken as public state enterprises because of the significant leadership role assumed by the governments of the day. In my view, the extent of the involvement of the government has led to a level of dependency on the government of the day to cater for the industries. In other words, the industries wait on government to tell them what to do. This dependence has a long history, which has been framed around the use of commodity boards enacted by legislation and controlled by governments through the use of subsidies or grants and low-interest credit. There's also the influence through the overwhelming use of technical personnel employed and deployed by the governments. These persons generally possess the highest levels of training in the agricultural sector. It is clear that there are problems associated with this level of dependence. I suggest that it might be time for key sectors of the agricultural industry to take on greater responsibility for directing their business. For primary agriculture to drive economic development in the Caribbean island states that are still dependent on it for this purpose, big crops which can bring in big bucks from exports are required. Given the relatively small production volumes expected on the account of the limited arable land available, the big crops can only be sustained and translated into big bucks if they produce a distinctive and desirable attributes relative to others in their commodity groups, and if upgrades of the value chain are done. With the exception of banana in the Windward Islands, arrowroot in St. Vincent, the Grenadines, spice and cocoa in Grenada, and sugarcane in the sugarcane exporting islands, none of the remaining crops were ever primary export drivers for economic development in recent times. The reasons are that they lack the scale of production and they are not set up as industries with appropriate infrastructure catering for input services, inclusive of financing, variety selection, field preparation, cultivation inputs, harvesting, grading, packaging, post-harvest handling, transportation to market, pricing, marketing, distribution, and research and development, all indispensable features of an agricultural industry configuration. Banana, sugar, nutmeg, cocoa, and arrowroot to a lesser extent have been generally set up with an appropriate industry infrastructure, and this has been overwhelmingly responsible for the dominance of the export agriculture in the relevant Caribbean island states. Given the limited amounts of arable land available, it is likely that one or two crops only of the big crop status might be possible. In the very recent past, as mentioned before, sugarcane, banana, and arrowroot to a lesser extent were the big crops that drove economic development significantly. It is unlikely that their cultivation will regain earlier peak status as drivers of economic development anytime soon, as they've been affected by drastic declines. Regaining market shares for them will require special efforts and new approaches. I now turn my attention to the next question posed. Is there adequate investment in agriculture to match crop production expectations? The relatively slow, stable, or declining yields characterizing the food crop sector are to a large measure symptomatic of a lack of significant new financial investment in this area of agriculture and an absence of the application of modern science and technology to address crop problems affecting yield. Next slide, please. With respect to financing available for agriculture, this is in the form of credit, of which there are two types, namely cash and input credit. Credit is available from several sources, including development banks, commercial banks, saving and loan banks, credit unions, local development institutions, donor projects, and trading organizations. The current size of the agricultural portfolio of these credit providers could not be ascertained in several Caribbean countries, but as recently as 2010, it was 3% of the asset of the former National Commercial Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and 22% of the country's National Development Foundation. The agricultural portfolio of the commercial banks, saving and loan banks, and credit unions are each less than 3% of their assets. Generally, credit provided by the banks for agriculture is in the microfinance category. For example, credit in the range of $5,000 to $15,000 East Caribbean dollars for a maximum of 4 years at interest rates ranging from 11 to 14% or accessible from the former National Commercial Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The National Development Foundation provided credit up to 80,000 East Caribbean dollars at interest rate at 9% with payment based on cash flows. Now, the information on the current number of farmers receiving credit could not be determined, but in 2010, it was 22.7%. 80% of the credit was of the input types. The agricultural loan portfolio, the acreage involved, the productivity of farms receiving credit relative to controls, and the relative technical and managerial supervision involved could not be obtained to assess the impact of the credit. Notwithstanding, based on personal experience, given the performance of the food crop sector over the last 30 years or so, it can be concluded that the financing available for this area of agriculture has not resulted in improving performance. As previously observed, this performance is symptomatic of a sector which has not received significant new investment over a relatively long period. The food crop sector cannot do better in the absence of significant new investment. New financing has to be utilized for it to meet or exceed expectations. Next slide. I now turn to the other question posed. Is crop production based on utilization of appropriate available modern science and technology? As mentioned before, a conclusion from the analysis of crop production information for the food crop sector is that for each major food crops, yield in general are stagnant and relatively low or are declining. Based on the expectations of an expanding food crop sector for both local consumption and export, this information is characteristic of constraints impacting productivity at the level of food crops. On the basis of experience of about 20 years providing research to the agricultural sectors, mainly in Barbados and the OECS, I have been able to identify some of the constraints to agriculture at the level of crop plant productivity. These pertain to soil fertility and soil degradation, difficulties in accessing water resources, and absence of genetic improvement of the root crops. Many of these constraints can be solved by the application of science and technology. I will not in this forum discuss the technical details of how these constraints are affecting crop production and the program of science and technology that will be required to address them. However, I will instead put the need for the application of an ongoing program of science and technology to address the relevant crop productivity constraints in its proper context. The context is that modern agriculture is a human construct. That is to say, it was invented. It is comprised of a series of managed or domesticated ecosystems that are totally dependent on artificial inputs. In these ecosystems, biodiversity is deliberately selected. And in the case of plants, they're cultivated as crops or reared as livestock in the case of animals. These types of ecosystems are the backbone of modern agriculture. Modern agriculture, with its dependence on artificial inputs, is a creature of science and technology. Historically, increases in agricultural output are almost entirely due to greater resource efficiency, in particular, technological advances in crops, animals, and farming systems that are the result of substantial investments in private and public agricultural research over time. At the level of plant crop production, the land and the living and non-living environments are in continuous flux. Many of these changes are short-term and cyclical, and some are more gradual and long-term in their occurrence, manifestation, and effects. The short-term changes may be daily or seasonal. Some are the result of cropping cycles. The long-term changes at the level of crop productivity are due mainly to the extractive nature of commercial agriculture, concomitant with its impact on the living or biotic environment, including the soil microflora and fauna, pests, weeds, and pathogens, and on water resources for irrigation. The long-term changes are also influenced by global climate. How these changes were managed over time are a good indication of the extent of agricultural success at the moment, and how they're managed from now on will be indicative of future success. There's need for good understanding of the changes, including their present and likely effects, and challenges and the available and emerging interventions or technologies to respond to them appropriately. The adoption of these interventions will be an integral part of the crop production and evaluation efforts if agriculture in the Caribbean is to keep up with time. If current agriculture in the Caribbean is based substantially on science and technology inputs of a gone-by era, the crop production results will be for that time and not for greater productivity through the use of more modern inputs. It should be mentioned also that a more scientific approach to agriculture would lend itself to greater predictability and insurability of the agricultural product and access to credit on more favorable terms, where credit appraisals would be done on the operations and credit worthiness and perhaps less reliant on collateral. Next slide. As you are aware, there are global concerns about practices which degrade the environment and the use of natural resources in unsustainable ways. These concerns are quite relevant to the Caribbean countries, and as a result, they have signed on to several multilateral environment agreements at global and regional levels to establish the framework for addressing them. Many of these agreements have legally binding obligations. Through these agreements, the countries have taken steps to implement measures for protection and sustainable use of the environment and natural resources. Often, there's a cost associated with implementing these measures, which are also expected to be ongoing. As you know, agriculture is the largest producer sector user of the open environment and space and land resource. It is both a source for the concerns about the environment and natural resources, and a bearer of the consequences of their degradation and unsustainable use. For example, in general, erosion and degradation of agricultural soils and the environment due to poor agricultural practices over time are also impacting negatively on agriculture through low and declining agricultural productivity and profitability. These factors impacting agriculture are made potentially worse by new and emerging threats posed by climate change. In this regard, the agricultural sector as a source of the concerns and aware of the negative consequences of them, should be in the vanguard with respect to implementing the applicable multilateral environment agreements, bearing in mind the cost implications. The question that should be asked is, how can the agricultural sector adopt measures for the protection and conservation of the environment and for the promotion of sustainable use of the natural resource in a programmatic way? My suggestion is to make the adoption of these measures an integral part of the performance expectations of the agricultural sector, in the same way that ensuring adequate levels of crop production for local consumption and export, promoting food security, and optimizing use of the arable land are commonly seen and accepted as responsibilities of the agricultural sector. Bearing in mind the cost implications associated with implementing the treaty obligations and the fact that an entire country benefits from conservation and protection of the environment, I suggest that the agricultural sector be regarded for this custodial role. I suggest that further that the reward be offered through a package of incentives for improving performance of the agricultural sector, and that measures taken to protect and conserve the environment and promote sustainable use of the natural resource be incorporated into future assessment performance of the agricultural sector. This reward could be framed around a model which I'm about to propose. The model also provides a framework for addressing problems pertaining to crop production, food security, financing, and the application of modern technology, all with the purpose of improving the prospects for agriculture. There are also important spin-offs opportunities for the economy in general. Let me remind you of the problems identified earlier by summarizing them. Low and declining agricultural productivity and profitability is the most pervasive and perhaps telling problem curtailing economic and social development in most Caribbean countries, where, for the most part, agriculture remains a primary economic activity. As mentioned before, this problem has its origins in the relatively small output of crops, relatively narrow agricultural base, underutilization of arable land, and movement of land out of agriculture for other lucrative commercial activities, such as residential development. In addition, crop productivity is low because of a lack of significant investment in agriculture and an inability to introduce appropriate modern science and technology and best practices in the area of crop production, marketing, and management. Erosion and degradation of agricultural soils and the environment in general due to poor agricultural practices over time are also impacting negatively on agriculture. These factors impacting agriculture are exacerbated by the new and emerging threats posed by climate change. Next slide. I will then now introduce a model which hopefully in part would lead to addressing some of the problems identified earlier and to turn around the agricultural sector. Now, the central approach of this model is to formally institute measures that will impact positively on the commercial value of agricultural land for lending purposes only in order to finance investment targeting improved agricultural performance. The measures referred to are specific inputs or drivers for improving the performance of agriculture. Access to financing linked to improved value of agricultural land is likely to increase the acreage and efficient use of arable land under cultivation and reduce the incentive to take land out of agriculture for competing commercial activities such as residential development. This approach recognizes that arable land is the most abundant commercially exploited natural resource asset in the Caribbean, and significant amounts of it are held as non-productive and underproductive parcels of land. In addition, ownership of this asset is generally widespread. In instances where arable land distributions have been successful, arable land is the primary asset of the rural population. The plan is therefore to institutionalize a system which will drive up the value of land for agriculture based on inputs and crop performance relative to land for competing activities. A formalized system for improving the value of agricultural land could be based on a set of drivers, which are also regarded here as inputs. The drivers are inclusive of the following. Next slide. The extent of contribution of farms to food security, the extent of contribution of farms to production for export, the extent to which farms in commercial cultivation cater for climate change adaptation and mitigation, the extent to which farms in commercial cultivation caters for conservation and protection of the environment and sustainable use of natural resource, and the extent to which farms introduce efficient and appropriate new technology to modernize agriculture. Other drivers could be included to address specific expectations as the need arises. For example, the extent to which post-harvest treatment, handling, and transportation will reduce consumer prices to address post-harvest losses, which in some instances could be as high as 40 to 60%. The access to funding is the basis of the incentive program I was referring to earlier with respect to incorporating inputs for the conservation and protection of the environment and the sustainable use of the natural resource. It is also the incentive program for the inputs or drivers mentioned. In this regard, the overall plan is to use the improved value of agricultural land as collateral to mobilize investment capital for agriculture and other areas of economic development. As mentioned before, for a significant portion of the agricultural holdings, tenure is insecure. This land tenure issue must be fully resolved to facilitate collateralization. Next slide. Now, only land in active agriculture will retain its improved commercial value under the plan. This plan will require the following: a system for determining the monetary value of the arable land as the natural resource asset, taking inputs into account. Approved natural resource evaluators, a system of laws to set up and regulate the system, that is to say the regulatory system, an administrative system for management of the program, a system for accessing the inputs, a system for financing the program, a system for monitoring and evaluation, a system for monitoring and verification of inputs, a system for risk assessment and risk management, and a system for public education. These systems are required to set up and operate the plan proposed. Their specific roles in the plan are generally self-explanatory, and for this reason, the functions of all but one of these systems are summarized here in the interest of time. The system for financing the program forms the core of the vitally important incentive package for including measures to improve the performance of agriculture. And on this basis, its role is selected to be discussed in greater relative detail. In summary, the necessary laws are required to establish the regime, including all of the other systems mentioned. Current land valuation practices in the Caribbean are not required to take natural resource and environment benefits into account for pricing. In the context of the model proposed here, these benefits and the contribution of each of the crop production drivers will be taken into account in the valuation. For this reasons, persons trained in the evaluation of environmental benefits derived from farming and contribution of the crop production drivers are required. Reference to the need for trained natural resource evaluators in the context of the model addresses this requirement. The approved inputs and relevant information must be readily accessible to farmers for consideration for introduction, and this is the responsibility of the system for accessing inputs. It will be necessary to review the model with respect to achieving its objective over time and to make adjustments as required. This will be the function of the monitoring and evaluation system. In addition, there will be a requirement to monitor farms with the objective of verifying that the recognized inputs are introduced for land valuation purposes. This will be the role of the system for monitoring and verification of inputs. The general public should be consulted to get its full support through the public education program. Another aspect of the public information program will be to target farmers with respect to the workings of the system and the responsibilities of the contracting partners. As there are risks associated with any undertaking, including the plan proposed and farming itself in particular, a program of risk assessment and risk management will be required to prevent or minimize the impact of adverse events. The model should be supported also by the appropriate crop industry infrastructure, inclusive of the elements previously mentioned. I will now expand on the role of the system for financing the program. The idea of collateralizing property, including agricultural land, for the purpose of obtaining credit is an integral aspect of the money lending trade. It is also common for the value of collateral to be based on intrinsic and extrinsic factors recognized by the marketplace. In the context of the model proposed here, the objective is to give greater formal recognition to several intrinsic factors, namely the input or drivers which are intended to address crop production shortcomings and to add value to the assets regarded here as the agricultural land or farm. The specific details for factoring the inputs in valuing agricultural land in the context of the model proposed have been worked out. I should also say that in this regard, there are methodologies and approaches available for valuing agricultural and natural resource efforts, including agricultural land, based on benefits to society in the context of sustainable development. As mentioned earlier, this model has potential spin-offs besides those linked to the agricultural sector. Taking into account the large number of arable land holdings in private ownership and their widespread distribution with respect to geography and demography, there is potential for improving and enlarging the economic activity and space if the model triggers major economic activities in areas not normally associated with agriculture. It is my opinion that the arable land as a productive asset and farmers' input are undervalued in monetary terms. The model will address this notion. It is worthwhile to illustrate further the potential of the model to mobilize substantial new funds for investment in agriculture and other areas of the economy. This illustration is by reference to the importance of residential holdings in securing financing from lending sources. Data obtained from a leading commercial bank in St. Vincent and the Grenadines show that it currently has a client base of 2,974 persons securing bank loans using residential holdings as security or collateral. The total collateral value is over 710 million East Caribbean dollars, and the corresponding loan amount is about 217 million East Caribbean dollars. For comparison with the agricultural sector, for comparison with the agricultural land in this model, each residential holding can be regarded as land and/or a house. The house can be regarded as an input which contributes to the value of the residential holding. Similarly, by comparison, the inputs of the crop production scenario should also be regarded for valuation of agricultural holdings. The total loan amount secured by collateralizing residential holdings in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was not obtained, but it will be drastically less than the credit for agriculture. Funding for the program, as mentioned before, is required, and public and private sector lending institutions should be provided with incentives to set up an agricultural portfolio tailored to the new approach. It is likely that the incentives would have to be in the form of credit guarantee. The government is the likely guarantor. It is assumed that citizens of the Caribbean countries, through their governments, will be prepared to pay a little bit more to secure wider-ranging benefits, including those associated with the protection and conservation of the environment and sustainable use of natural resources. It might be possible to target global funding sources for grants set aside for the implementation of multilateral environment agreements, of which Caribbean countries are parties to, for part financing required. Notably, there are funds currently available to Caribbean countries for implementing programs for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and for the protection and conservation of the environment and sustainable use of the natural resource. The proposed model caters for the implementation of these programs through the drivers pertaining to the protection and conservation of the environment and the sustainable use of natural resource and climate change adaptation and mitigation. An advantage of using this financing in this manner described is that the funds will be replenished as credits or loans obtained by farmers in the context of the model will have to be repaid. The model, therefore, is a basis for sustaining programs on climate change adaptation and mitigation and protection and conservation of the environment and sustainable use of natural resources. In the current practice, the funds referred to are depleted and are not replenished at the end of the targeted implementation program. In this lecture, I have looked at trends in the performance of the crop agriculture to identify and highlight areas of concerns in their patterns. In addressing these areas of concerns, new perspectives on the way forward for a more profitable and sustainable agricultural enterprise were proposed for consideration. The proposals is also intended to benefit other areas of the economy significantly. Based on the inputs mentioned, new and improved skill sets in an appropriate institutional framework will be required to implement the plan. As mentioned also, the plan must also be supported by upgrades of the value chain and formation of industry infrastructure, particularly for crops targeted for export. I believe that the plan could be a good candidate for financing as a test case for other countries with similar profile. I hope that giving of your time to come here to listen to me has been worthwhile for you. I thank you all very much for coming.